Good day, class. In this lecture, we are going to discuss one of the most important topics in human behavior under criminology, and this is all about coping mechanism and defense mechanism. These concepts are very important because in real life, especially in law enforcement and criminology practice, you will constantly deal with individuals who are under stress, trauma, pressure, or emotional conflict. And in order to understand their behavior, we must first understand how the human mind responds to stress. Let us begin with coping mechanism. Coping mechanism refers to the sum total of ways in which people deal with minor to major stress and trauma. Some of these processes are unconscious, others are learned behavior, and still others are skills that individuals consciously master in order to reduce stress or other intense emotions like depression. In simple terms, coping mechanism is how a person handles stress in everyday life. It can be healthy or unhealthy, conscious or unconscious, meaning sometimes we are aware of how we cope, and sometimes we are not even aware that we are already using certain coping strategies. For example, a criminology student who is under academic pressure may cope by studying harder, exercising, praying, or seeking support from friends. This is an example of positive coping. However, some students may also cope in unhealthy ways, such as procrastination, isolation, or engaging in vices just to escape stress. So, coping mechanism is basically how a person survives emotional pressure. Now let us move to defense mechanism. Defense mechanisms refer to an individual's way of reacting to frustration. These are unconscious psychological strategies brought into play to cope with reality and to maintain self-image. According to Sigmund Freud, defense mechanisms are methods that the ego uses to avoid recognizing ideas or emotions that may cause personal anxiety. It is an unrealistic strategy used by the ego to discharge tension. In simple explanation, defense mechanisms are automatic psychological protections of the mind. The person is usually not aware that he or she is already using them. The main purpose is to protect the ego from anxiety, guilt, or emotional discomfort. For example, when a student fails an exam and says, "Hindi naman talaga ako bumagsak, mali lang ang teacher," that is denial. The reality is being rejected in order to protect self-esteem. Another example is when a person is heartbroken but says, "Wala naman talaga akong feelings sa kanya," which is also a form of defense mechanism to avoid emotional pain. Now let us go deeper into different types of defense mechanisms. First is cluster 1, action and aggression. This includes behaviors like acting out, attack, passive aggression, and provocation. Acting out happens when a person expresses unacceptable desires through actions without thinking of consequences. For example, a student who is angry at an instructor may suddenly walk out or shout instead of expressing frustration properly. Attack refers to direct aggression when a person feels threatened. Passive aggression, on the other hand, is indirect expression of anger, such as intentionally delaying tasks or being sarcastic. Provocation happens when a stressed person tries to trigger others in order to shift attention away from his or her own problem. Next is cluster 2, avoidance and escape. This includes avoidance, denial, fantasy or daydreaming, suppression, and repression. Avoidance is simply staying away from stressful situations. Denial is refusing to accept reality, such as acting like nothing happened, even when a serious event occurred. Fantasy or daydreaming happens when a person escapes reality through imagination, especially when goals are not achievable. Suppression is conscious blocking of thoughts, while repression is unconscious pushing of painful thoughts into the subconscious mind. Next is cluster 3, cognitive and rationalization. This includes rationalization and intellectualization. Rationalization happens when a person creates logical explanations to justify unacceptable behavior or failure. Intellectualization is when a person avoids emotional distress by focusing only on logic, facts, or technical explanation, ignoring emotional impact. Next is cluster 4, shifting target. This includes displacement, projection, substitution, and altruism. Displacement happens when emotions are redirected from the original source to a safer target. For example, a person angry at a supervisor may go home and shout at family members instead. Projection happens when a person attributes his or her own unacceptable feelings to others, such as a guilty person accusing others of being guilty. Substitution happens when a stressful situation is replaced with something less stressful. Altruism is coping by focusing on helping others, instead of focusing on personal pain. Next is Cluster 5, somatic and biological responses. This includes conversion, emotionality, fight or flight reaction, and somatization. Conversion happens when emotional stress turns into physical symptoms, such as paralysis or blindness without medical cause. Emotionality refers to the buildup of strong emotions like anger or fear due to stress. Fight or flight reaction is the body's automatic response to perceived danger, either to confront the threat or escape from it. Somatization happens when psychological problems are expressed through physical illness symptoms such as headaches or stomach pain. Next is Cluster 6, altering perception and reality. This includes dissociation, idealization, trivializing, and symbolization. Dissociation happens when a person separates thoughts from conscious awareness to avoid emotional conflict. Idealization is when a person overestimates the positive qualities of something or someone. Trivializing is minimizing the importance of a serious issue. Symbolization is when inner conflicts are expressed through symbols or symbolic actions. Next is Cluster 7, identity and ego adjustment. This includes compensation, identification, introjection, and reaction formation. Compensation happens when a person strengthens one area to cover weakness in another. Identification is when a person adopts behaviors or traits of another individual. Introjection is when a person internalizes characteristics of others to cope with situations. Reaction formation happens when a person behaves in the opposite way of what he or she truly feels. Next is Cluster 8, reversal and regression. Regression happens when a person returns to childlike behavior under stress. Undoing is when a person tries to cancel out a previous action by doing the opposite. Help rejecting complaining happens when a person asks for help but rejects all assistance offered. Next is Cluster 9, extreme maladaptive response. This includes self-harming behavior, where a person deliberately inflicts harm on himself or herself as a response to emotional pain or extreme psychological distress. Finally, Cluster 10, transformative and positive coping. This includes sublimation, post-traumatic growth, and positive coping. Sublimation is when negative impulses are transformed into productive or socially acceptable activities. Post-traumatic growth is when a person experiences positive psychological change after trauma. Positive coping includes problem solving, identifying root causes, benefit finding, and spiritual growth. To conclude, coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms are both essential in understanding human behavior. Coping mechanisms help us deal with stress in both healthy and unhealthy ways, while defense mechanisms are unconscious psychological strategies that protect the ego from anxiety.